Hi, this is Craig Stocks here at Utah Desert Remote Observatories. You can find us online at utahdesertremote.com. In this video, we're going to focus on color. The previous video, we talked about stretching. We're going to take that concept a step further now and talk about how stretching affects color and some of the controls you can use to adjust your color. So first of all, let's talk just briefly about where the color comes from. Color images, typically we're working with an image that's in the RGB, red, green, blue color model. So we have a red channel, a green channel, and a blue channel. And red, green, and blue combine, as we probably already know, to create a neutral color or white. So if we look at this example, we have a red circle, a green circle, and a blue circle. Where they overlap, red and blue make magenta, green and blue make cyan, green and red make yellow. And anytime all three of those colors are in equal amounts, so we have equal amounts of red, green, and blue, then we have a neutral color. It's a white, black, gray, something without a distinct color cast. And when we say a color cast, for instance, if I gave this image a color cast, let's say we increased the red brightness. So it may not be completely obvious, but if you look at something that should be neutral, you can see that in fact the central section here is no longer neutral. It's off color now. It has a red tinge to it. So we would say this whole image has a red color cast. When you take images with your cell phone or DSLR or whatever, typically your system, when it processes from the raw sensor data into a JPEG or a TIFF or something you can look at, it does two things. It stretches the image to make it bright enough to see. It also applies a color balance or a white balance of some sort. Generally, the way they do that, if we start with this image, it has some amount of a color cast to it. It looks like it's kind of greenish colored. This is a little bit oversimplified, but what your camera does is it looks at the overall color of the image. And it might do that by just making a copy. And if we just calculate the average of this entire image, so this cyan color, that's the average color of this entire image. Now your camera works on the assumption that most scenes on average are going to be neutral. So they'll have equal amounts of greens and blues and reds and yellows and purples and so forth, so that when you add it all together and average it, it should be pretty close to a neutral color. Most of the time that's a pretty good assumption. Our world tends to have a wide variety of colors. So what your camera does is basically neutralizes this color by applying the opposite color. And we'll just apply that through an overlay. And you can see that now, by applying the opposite of the average color of this scene, we've restored it to something that looks natural. If I turn that overlay off, that's what it looked like before with that cyan or green color cast. And this is what it looks like once we have corrected for the color cast. Another way of correcting for a color cast is if you have something in the image that you know is supposed to be neutral. For instance, this wood is very weathered and has a gray appearance. The stones over here are pretty neutral gray. Sometimes you can include a reference card of some sort that you know is neutral. But a lot of processing software will have a tool of some sort that you can use an eyedropper and click on some area that you believe should be neutral, and it will apply color corrections such that that thing that you said is supposed to be neutral comes out neutral, and that tends to cause all the other colors to kind of fall into place. So two different ways of color correcting an image that has a color cast. One would be by finding a neutral color reference or a known color reference and adjusting everything to that. Another would be just by taking the overall average and finding an average that's neutral. How does this relate to astrophotography? Generally in astrophotography, we don't have a neutral color reference. There's not a neutral gray card floating around in space. By convention, we tend to make our backgrounds neutral. We tend to think of the sky as being a neutral, very dark gray, almost black. In reality, if you're standing on Earth taking photos, the sky is not neutral. It's going to have some color cast to it. Even if you have zero light pollution, you're going to have sky glow. It'll be kind of a greenish color. So in reality, even though by convention we choose to make that background of our astro images very dark gray with no color cast to them, in reality it does have a color cast when you capture the image. But if we hop into PixInsight and see how this might apply, when we looked in our previous video at this image of the Lagoon Nebula, when we did an unlinked stretch of this RGB image, that gave us pretty natural looking colors. What it was doing under the hood was finding the equivalent of an average color balance. So it was neutralizing the color by finding a uniform brightness to each of the red, green, and blue channels such that they tended to average each other so that we had, on average, a neutral color cast. So what we did with that overlay in Photoshop is basically the same thing that's happening here. PixInsight is stretching each one of these red, green, and blue channels by the same amount so that we get a neutral looking image when we're done. And that gets us pretty close to true colors. And usually you wind up with a neutral background, more or less correct stars. A more precise way of adjusting the stars is to use a tool like spectrophotometric color calibration. What it does is go through the image and it looks at the reference stars in the image and compares them to a database of those stars' actual colors. And it attempts to find a color balance such that each one of those stars is as close as possible to its correct color, and it does that by applying a uniform color balance across the entire image. So if we were to run SPCC on this RGB image, I'll just go ahead and apply it. And that's what SPCC is going to do. It's going to go through, find stars that it knows what color they should be, and then it attempts to find a color balance such that those stars are as close to correct as possible. That doesn't tell you anything about the background. It doesn't tell you anything about what color the nebula should be. It really just tells you what color the stars might be in a perfect world. And it gives you a report when it's done, and it's just finishing up. It gives us a report that shows these RGB values that it knows versus what they should be. And in a perfect world, all of the dots, all the samples that it checked should lie along a straight line. That would indicate that this chosen color balance does a good job of getting all of the stars pretty close to where they should be, even though most of them aren't perfect, but they're close, and they're closer than they were. Now, our preview image has gone from looking correct to looking very incorrect. And that's because we haven't updated this screen transfer function. And remember, the screen transfer function is only a preview. It's not actually changing the image. But if I update this image, now it will show it more correct. But now that we've applied SPCC, we no longer want to do this auto white balance trick, because we now have a specific white balance. And this would be comparable to clicking on a reference color. We now know the colors of the stars should be correct if we keep everything else the same. And to keep everything else the same, that means we need to do a linked stretch. So when I click on the link icon in the STF tool and update the auto stretch, now we see even better colors, and we also have some assurance that the stars have been adjusted so that they are close to the correct color for each one of those stars. And if the stars are correct, then we assume everything else must be pretty correct also. So that's kind of the first step to color correction in a color workflow, is either using an auto color balance through an unlinked stretch of an RGB image, or using a color reference like the SPCC stars and finding a color balance such that the stars have the right color on average, and then applying that color balance to the entire image. So that's a way of, a little bit behind the scenes of how color balance is handled in PixInsight with RGB images. The next video will look at doing this with narrowband images. So hope you found this useful. If you have any questions, drop those in the comments. And as always, I hope you have a great day today and an even better night tonight under a clear, dark sky. Thanks.